So welcome everyone to our panel discussion, Democratic Vistas, Autocratic Specters, Must We Reinvent Democracy? My name is Johannes Voelz. I am a professor of American Studies at Goethe University in Frankfurt and a board member at the Forschungskolleg Humanwissenschaften, our Center for Advanced Study in the Humanities. And today we are launching a new research focus here at the Forschungskolleg, Democratic Vistas, Reflections on the Atlantic World. And for today's event, we have teamed up with the Institute for the Human Sciences, the IWM or IWM at Vienna. So the Forschungskolleg Humanwissenschaften and the IWM are jointly hosting this event, and indeed, Shalini Randeria, the director of the IWM, is one of our panelists tonight. Now, launching this new research group is a festive occasion, and I am very honored that we will have two welcome remarks to start us off. The first one by the president of Goethe University Frankfurt, Professor Enrico Schleiff, and the second one by the director of the Forschungskolleg Humanwissenschaften, Professor Matthias Lutz-Bachmann. So, Professor Schleiff, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule, and the floor is all yours.
Dear panelists, dear Masha Gessen, dear Shalini Randeria, who also as director of IWM is co-hosting the event, dear Sławomir Sierakowski, and dear Johannes, my dear friend Matthias, Lutz-Bachmann, dear fellows and former fellows of the Forschungskolleg Humanwissenschaften, and dear fellows of the Institute für die Wissenschaften vom Menschen in Vienna. Dear colleagues and students of Goethe universities, dear friends, dear ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the launch of a new research topic, Democratic Vistas, Reflection on the Atlantic World, and the event today, which is hosted by the Forschungskolleg Humanwissenschaften, which is one of the two institutes for advanced studies of Goethe University and the Institute for Advanced Studies in Humanities, and the Institute für die Wissenschaften vom Menschen in Vienna. I am very, very happy to open this event, and with it, this new research focus. This research focus, Democratic Vistas, Reflection on the Atlantic World, brings together researchers from different disciplines within the humanities and social sciences at Goethe universities and beyond, in order to explore the potential and the limitations of the Atlantic world in addressing the future of democracy. Could anything be more important in the post-Trump era? I think we would all agree that this is one of the most urgent issues of our time. The pictures of January 6th, the storming of the Capitol in Washington, D.C., are all still in our minds. Pictures that illustrated that democracy is a good that society has to fight for every day. That is why I'm delighted that Goethe University, as a large research university in the heart of Europe, with a long-standing track record on shaping democratic vistas, has the resources and ability to respond to political and societal developments quickly, with interdisciplinary research on a high level, whilst bringing together voices from different cultures of knowledge. Therefore, my thanks goes to the panelists for their readiness to help create the new research focus by participating in today's event. And I might add that attracting such renewed speakers with outstanding expertise and thus allowing a multitude of perspectives to be heard is itself an important contribution to the cultivation of democracy and a way of participating in democracy. Furthermore, allow me to give my thanks to the Institute für die Wissenschaften vom Menschen for co-hosting, to Johannes Voelz, Gunther Hellmann, and Matthias Lutz-Bachmann for conceiving of the research focus, and of course to all people of the Forschungskolleg for organizing this event. My wish for today's event is that the interdisciplinary space created by the Forschungskolleg for this research focus proves to be a productive form of democratic practice, a place where new ideas develop that can move society forward on the basis of excellent research. And the Forschungskolleg is the ideal place. It has ample experience in organizing exchange between different disciplines, between different cultures of knowledge, and between different sectors of society by providing, in usual not pandemic times, the generous space for the floating of ideas, and in these times, the same space, but in a figurative sense. So, welcome again, all of you. And please enjoy your virtual stay here at Goethe University's Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities. And don't hesitate, as soon as pandemic is over, to visit us and to join our discussions in presence. Thank you and have a fantastic scientific day.
Thank you, Enrico, for these very kind and encouraging words. And I would now like to hand over to Professor Matthias Lutz-Bachmann, the director of the Forschungskolleg Humanwissenschaften.
Thank you, Johannes. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, we are so proud and honored by your presence and attendance today. This afternoon or morning, in the case of the American participants, is a time we planned really for a couple of years, realizing that the transatlantic relations consists in much more than economy or military cooperation. We share similar histories. We share analogous values, but above all, we share a common good of ideas and traditions, namely democracy. And this democracy is something we have to fight for intellectually, politically, and to prepare the ground for democratic culture, values, and the virtue of the person as an individual, as a centerpiece of all legitimate democratic systems. And referring to the events we have been partly part of or just attended, not only recently in the US, but everywhere in the transatlantic world, in Europe, as like in Middle America or South America or parts of Africa. This is all part of the Atlantic world. We see that we have, as intellectuals, as universities, as researchers, an enormous responsibility to think about our cultural, political, legal, and philosophical self-understandings towards the system, which is described in the words of Whitman as a democratic vista, a view of democracy concerning our presence and the life of our children and the next generations to come. And as an Institute of Advanced Studies, we are not only accustomed, like Enrico already pointed to, we are not only able to organize such an event and a research platform, we are in our self-understanding defined by such a program we want to develop with you, not only as an institute which provides possibilities to exchange opinions and argumentation, but as the network we are, and insofar you are, each of us who is participating is a member of this network which is necessary in order to reflect upon the future prospects of democracy and our institute is somehow tonight or this morning the hub where this can be brought forward. I thank you. I myself will participate in the whole debate and the upcoming events of our program. We are now starting with this morning and this afternoon, and I would like to ask Johannes Voelz now to introduce our speakers to this distinguished audience. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthias, for these remarks. And before I introduce the panelists, let me just very briefly frame today's discussion, and I promise this will not take more than 2 minutes. The title of our event points to the ambiguity of the present state of democracy. Democratic Vistas, Autocratic Specters, two different views of one and the same situation. In the last decades, we have seen the rise of a large number of authoritarian regimes that have managed to dismantle democracy from the inside out. Some speak of soft authoritarianism, others of a new despotism, and yet others speak of illiberal democracy. Whatever you call it, liberal democracy seems to be under attack almost everywhere. On the other hand, however, there are what Walt Whitman called democratic vistas. We observe ever new protest movements that fight for a more democratic society, whether they target corruption, as currently in Russia, or whether they want to confront white supremacy, as in the United States. So in our discussion, we want to disentangle these two perspectives to get a better understanding of them. And we also want to look ahead and discuss whether democracy needs to be reinvented and how this can be done. And the question in our title, must we reinvent democracy, may strike you as merely rhetorical. But in fact, it isn't actually meant as a simple rhetorical question, because after all, one may argue that what democracy needs is reform rather than reinvention. So the question is, what kind of remodeling does democracy need at its various levels? At the level of a more participatory political process, and here we might consider, for example, initiatives for citizen councils. At the level of an enlivened civil society, where we might think of new forms of political organizing. And finally, at the level of culture, where we could consider new democratic imaginaries. To discuss these questions, I am fortunate to have three outstanding guests who I want to introduce to you now. And after having introduced them, we'll jump into a discussion for about 35 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for your questions and comments. And we'll close the event at 6:15 Central European Time, so after 75 minutes or in 58 minutes. Okay, so Masha Gessen is a Russian-American journalist, a staff writer at The New Yorker, a distinguished writer in residence at Bard College, and the author of 11 books, among them The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia, which won the National Book Award in 2017, and Surviving Autocracy, a painstaking analysis of Trumpism, which appeared last year. After more than 20 years as a journalist and editor in Moscow, Masha has been living in New York City since 2013. Shalini Randeria is a world-renowned social anthropologist. She directs the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, the IWM, as I already said, and in this function, she serves as my co-host tonight, or today, depending on where you are. Shalini also directs the Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. And rather than mentioning her many, many writings, I want to highlight her new podcast called Democracy in Question, in which she discusses the challenges to representative democracy of the present moment with leading scholars from around the world. And I can only recommend this podcast. I've been an avid consumer of it. And you can access Democracy in Question through all major podcast outlets. Finally, on our panel, Sławomir Sierakowski is a sociologist, author and activist from Warsaw, Poland, where he runs Krytyka, Polityczna, an organization that has supported various civil society initiatives in Ukraine, Russia, Moldova, and Belarus, and not to forget Poland. Krytyka Polityczna is a combination of publishing house, news outlet, intellectual hub, and activist co-op. And Sławomir is a leading public intellectual and expert of Eastern and Central Europe. He is a constant presence on Polish television, and he writes for international publications such as the New York Times, The Guardian, the New York Review of Books, and also he's a senior fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations. So welcome to all three of you. It's great to have you here. I'm very excited about this and looking forward to our discussion. And I want to start right into it and want to begin with the title of our event today, Democratic Vistas, Autocratic Specters. With respect to the United States, where do we currently stand? Masha, you are the one who has written most extensively on Trumpism. What would be your take? And sorry, Masha, you have to switch on your microphone, I believe.
Yes, I guess that will help. Thank you. And thank you for that introduction. So in writing about Trumpism, I have actually used a model proposed by the Hungarian scholar Balint Magyar in his work on autocracies, which in itself was an eye-opening experience for me because, at first I thought, wouldn't it be sort of poetic justice to try to apply this model to the United States? Because Magyar's premise of a lot of his work is that, look, we have been using the wrong language to describe what goes on in Eastern Europe since 1989. In 1989, we started using the language of liberal democracy to talk about Eastern Europe, both because we assumed that that's what was going to happen, and because that's the language of political science. And by using terminology from the study of liberal democracy, we missed a lot of things because they weren't part of that vocabulary. We were looking in the wrong places. And so, sort of based on that premise, he proposes an entire taxonomy of post-communist autocratic regimes. And I can't recommend his work highly enough. And so when I was looking for ways to talk about Trumpism, I thought I will try to borrow his model and see what happens. And what happened was that it was incredibly helpful, much more helpful than I would have been comfortable with. So when Magyar talks about autocracies, he talks about autocratic attempt, autocratic breakthrough, and autocratic consolidation as the three stages. And put very simply, autocratic attempt is the stage of autocracy when it is still reversible by electoral means. Autocratic breakthrough is what usually happens in the second term of an autocrat's rule, when structural and institutional changes occur that make it impossible to reverse autocracy by electoral means. And then autocratic consolidation, which is self-explanatory, it's consolidation of power, consolidation of institutions, consolidation of domination over the information sphere. So, writing my book last year, I was working on the premise that we're witnessing an autocratic attempt, and that the test of what was going to happen next was going to be the November 2020 election. And I think that's an important framing to think about that election as a test of the autocratic attempt, because it's incredibly tempting, and certainly we're hearing a lot of that rhetoric in this country, to say the institutions saved us. Look, the people spoke. There's been a peaceful transfer of power. Our national nightmare is over. But really, we just barely survived that election as a country and as an institutional democracy. The insurrection on January 6th, but not just the incredibly raw and shocking footage of the insurrection, but what happened after the insurrection, which is that the overwhelming majority of Republicans in the House of Representatives, the lower house of Congress, voted against certifying the election. Right? So here we have a very stark example. It is Congress's actual job to exercise control over the power of the presidency. It is also Congress's actual job to certify the results of an election. And here we have the overwhelming majority, more than 120 people, of the Republican members of Congress, immediately following the insurrection, immediately following having their lives endangered by a violent uprising, shirk the responsibilities of both of those jobs in a very explicit manner. And so, I think what we have seen is we have seen the transformation of one of the two political parties into an autocratic party. And I write about that in Surviving Autocracy, and one of the things that I talk about is that I think the difference between, and this is a very sort of media take, but I think it's helpful, the difference between a Democratic Party, small d, and an autocratic party is the difference in political audience. The audience of a Democratic Party are voters. The audience of an autocratic party is the autocrat. And what we saw throughout the 4 years of the Trump administration was the Republican Party increasingly addressing itself solely to Donald Trump, solely to the autocrat. And I would argue that's exactly what we saw after the insurrection. It is again what we saw during the impeachment trial, both in the House and in the Senate. And it is particularly what we have seen since the vote in the Senate, which is that over the weekend, the Senate voted to acquit Donald Trump. Every single Republican senator who broke with the party and voted for conviction has been censured by the local Republican Party in their state, right? So have been effectively disowned by the party. So what I think we're seeing one of the two political parties actually consolidating itself as an autocratic party. And that I think is incredibly terrifying, incredibly dangerous. And at this point, the next stage of the autocratic attempt. Now, what makes it very strange is that I don't know that Donald Trump is still going to be on the political scene in 4 years. He is he's old, he's very unhealthy, and he has a very short attention span. So I think we may be dealing with some kind of Trumpism without Trump. But there are other Trumps, and there are also many other or several other aspiring autocrats in the very visible ranks of the Republican Party. So that would be my appraisal of the democratic/autocratic situation in the United States today.
Thank you. Yes, I think that is a very helpful perspective. And if I would redescribe this, I would say right now it appears as if the autocratic attempt had failed, but what is building in the background is in fact something like a surge of an autocratic breakthrough, so that if in the next elections the Trumpist movement should come back to power again, we would go right to the level of autocratic breakthrough rather than stay at the level of attempt. It seems to me that this would be one way of adapting perhaps the model to what is happening in the US.
I think that's a great summary, yeah.
Shalini, you, I remember, had recently John Keane on your podcast, who suggested, and has suggested that in his most recent book, that the language of authoritarianism and autocracy is actually ill-suited to describe the new forms of non-democratic rule. And I wonder if you would respond that in relation to what Masha has just presented. What's your take on that? Do you think that the language of autocracy is in fact useful as for analytical purpose of the present situation, or would you go along with your interview partner John Keane and say we have to find new terms? And you have to unmute yourself.
Thanks for the invitation to both jointly host the event with you and for the invitation to speak. I have a point of view which differs from John Keane's. His book is called The New Despotism. He's trying to move the debate to the term. I mean, he's looking through tyranny and he's giving up autocracy and authoritarianism. He would like us to use the language of despotism. It's too long an argument to go into, but maybe let me just briefly say what my take on this is. I have been using the term soft authoritarianism instead. Not that I think all soft authoritarian regimes have exactly the same genesis or exactly the same characteristics, but I do think they have a few things in common. And I think they would stretch from Trump to Erdogan, to Modi, to Orban. So Bolsonaro, they really go across the globe. And that's why I think it's an interesting way to think about it. And I think it's the language is not unimportant because, as you know, one of the questions which is under discussion is, are these neo-fascist regimes, etc.? So should we use the term fascism for them or not? So I think the language does matter a lot. But I think the characteristics that I would like to set out are the following. I think these are all regimes in which there is crony capitalism. So these are not neoliberal regimes in any total sense of the term. They use the market selectively, but they are basically either in the Trump case where there is a family to be enriched, in the Orban case as well. In the Indian case, the prime minister has no family, but it's a coterie of industrialists to be enriched, etc., etc. So there is a crony capitalist element to all of these. There is toxic masculinity to all of them. So I think gender plays a huge role in the way these politicians have represented themselves and are also perceived. I think they're all playing with some form of the other of an ethnic or religious nationalism. They are all formally democratically elected and with large majorities, unlike in the US, where the majority was not that large. But the other regimes are all with very large electoral majorities. And they've used this majoritarianism to dismantle from the inside using democratic means. So changing the constitutions, changing the laws. In the Hungarian case, I think you have a playbook which you can really look systematically at how you can dismantle democracy from the inside, change the constitution, then change the electoral rules, then change the information, the freedom of information rules, then change rules for civil society, finally throughout the Central European University. So there is a whole attack and a systematic attack on intermediate institutions, civil society institutions of various kinds. So it's a slow corrosion, piecemeal. And the interesting thing is it's very difficult, and this is why I liked Masha's three-phase analytics, because the question is, when is a red line really crossed? And unless we have a good kind of understanding of where the red lines are, it's just too late before we've realized what the accumulated damage done to the institutions is. Courts play a huge role in all of these regimes. So they all maintain a semblance of the rule of law. And I think Emmeline Schäuble has a very good term. She calls it autocratic legalism. That's the term she uses for Orban, but I wouldn't reserve it for Orban alone. Slavik will tell you in a moment what the attack on the judiciary in Poland has meant, in both Turkey and in India. It's very much a question of how to subvert the rule of law, which is part of the story as well. So I think there is a common kind of toolkit which is used in different ways in these different countries. But so they are authoritarian regimes, and I say soft because I mean, Putin has crossed the limit of soft by poisoning a lot of his opponents. But for the rest, the worst they have done so far is throw people in jail. There have not been political murders on any large scale. The violence is limited depending on how we want to define it. Of course, there's structural violence. And in all of these regimes, there is a fear of what Arjuna Padurai has called the fear of small numbers. There's a fear of minorities. There's a fear of minorities, be they ethnic minorities, be they religious minorities. And then I think the gendered element, and we can discuss this with Masha, I think in all of these countries, the interesting thing for me these days is the emphasis on demographics. So it's always about the majority, which is an endangered majority, but it's a huge majority, but it always plays the victim of either a historical injustice or it's about to demographically die out. And therefore, if you look at the Indian case, for example, the entire move for changing the Citizenship Act in India is about basically disenfranchising Muslims. And this is very much a case of a Hindu majoritarian government feeling threatened by a very small Muslim minority. So let me just stop there with saying, I mean, that's the kind of regime I'm trying to characterize when you think about the second part of your topic, which is the autocratic specters. There is really corrosion and a dismantling from the inside using some combination of these measures. And I think they are also learning, these regimes, they are learning from one another and sort of trying to see what works, what doesn't work. Some things work in some contexts better than others, but what you do see are common characteristics.
Thank you. Sławomir, in fact, I would like you to address the case of the peace government in Poland. And, you know, one of the riddling things to me about the situation in Poland is that it seems as if the relation to the Trump government was exceedingly important, and yet the political style of Trump versus Kaczynski seems to be, for an outside observer, so radically different. So perhaps you can say something about where the Polish case would fit into Shalini's model of soft authoritarianism. But then I would also really like to know where you see the relation to Trumpism.
Okay, I'll unmute myself. Well, Poland is different, just in general. So, I mean, and I'm not only joking, but I'm also saying, like, if I would like to refer to the model that Shalini referred, we don't have chronic capitalism. Kaczynski doesn't have even a bank account. He doesn't have a driving license. He has a cat, and probably that's it. He owns nothing. He doesn't care much about, and there are not really oligarchy in Poland. Poland probably is the least corrupt country in Eastern Europe. Poland has many, many disadvantages, and it's a really problematic country, but does certain significant differences that leads me to some doubts, if like to put it into the same box, and especially with India, with some, I'm not an expert, but I think there are certain really, really significant differences between, let's say, it's Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Referring to what Masha said, I would say, and of course, I don't want to repeat some already well-known arguments why institutions saved America, but well, if you want me to theorize a little at the beginning, but in most basic terms, in Poland, you can see clearly how modern populism is more originally, at least, an antithesis of liberalism rather than democracy. Of course, at the end of the day, what happened in America and what happened, or what could have happened earlier in Poland in May, when peace tried to even rig elections, presidential elections, to organize it in the apogee of pandemic, when it was obvious that only fanatics of peace, and peace doesn't have supporters. Peace has really almost or unofficial members of a party, like an army, like people really say, do what is told, what they are told to do. So it was clear that they will win elections, that it will be not fair. I mean, and still they were pushing to do it. And but like the things that made them angry and the things that they really like genetically hate are originally comes to the liberal tradition or the liberal, let's say, mindset, separation of power. And by the way, we usually use the same term to put America, Poland, Germany to the same box when we are talking about separation of power. There is nothing like American separation of power in countries like Poland, but even in Germany. Like in Poland, you cannot become president without being supported, selected by the party. Also, the same in general in Germany. The real and only strong separation of power, which I think played a crucial role, you have in America, when you have really three very independent centers of power. In the traditional separation of power, it's not only about separation, it's also about equality between them and equal influence. And I think you still have it in US, and you don't really have it, or you can easily lose it, at least in Eastern Europe. Where the tradition of checks and balances is really an imported tradition, okay? And free media, judiciary, all the things that peace is trying to dismantle originally belong rather to the liberal mindset. And they are like, I mean, I think we shouldn't treat liberalism and democracy together, but on the other hand, at the end of the day, they are dependent, because if you don't have liberalism, no free media, no free judiciary, you cannot really win elections if you belong to opposition. Okay, so I agree till the half of the way, and then I would have some doubts at the end of this way. But like what you were describing in your introductory, you were talking about democratic personality, and I would say that it's a question of, I would even like, to me this would be more a question of liberal mind, which is something that we should really make an effort to do, to create, to support, and to analyze in Eastern Europe.
That's very interesting. So what you're referring to here with a democratic personality is an idea that I take from Walt Whitman, who is in a sense the patron saint of our event, who thought of democracy not as something having primarily to do with the political system, nor with society, but with the self, and with a particular self. And the way that Whitman imagined it was that a democratic personality is constituted of a multiplicity of voices. And now it's very interesting that you make that switch towards liberalism and think of a liberal self, which has a long tradition in American thought with people like Lionel Trilling and stuff. But it's very interesting to me to, at this moment in time, sort of go back to the tradition of liberalism and make a case for that, as you seem to be doing here. What would it exactly mean to speak of a liberal self that needs to be cultivated in order for democracy to have a longer shelf life? Can we, I wonder if you could perhaps, Sławek, spell this out, if you talk about what you witnessed in Belarus, in the uprising in Belarus last summer that you witnessed firsthand. Would you say that this is a case study at which you can observe a liberal self the way you suggested it emerges?
Here I can give you another, maybe a little bit more surprising alternative to this like democratic personality and to liberal mind. I would say that like what played a crucial role and what was really shocking in Belarus was not that all the differences between Belarus, that it's not an autocracy. Like in Belarus, you have a leader with a real, still totalitarian ambitions. So, you know, Putin doesn't care much if, like, you know, we will publish as a Russian publishers this book or another one, what people privately will say, think, if they will make jokes. Of course, he would like to be, you know, I mean, respected and even loved, but it's not, you know, what you do in your private life. It's like, you know, it's like Catholic Church in Poland, okay? What's important is who rules in the public sphere, but what you do in your private life, they don't really care much. So of course, and in Belarus, which is the real and only inheritant of Soviet Union, you have KGB there. The death penalty is, you know, is executed by the shot in the head. So it's a really tradition that still is referring, and it's still strongly Sovietized. But what emerged there, and I'm not sure if it's a democratic personality or liberal mind first, but what really made the difference were women. And the only thing that, like, from the theory that like associates or that I have the connotation with is a kind of a revolutionary class. And I would even put it to the more Eastern European situation. Women are really, and now in Poland, multidimensionally, almost in every dimension, the only oppressed class with more and more like common class consciousness. You know, economically they are underpaid. Politically, they are underrepresented. Now they even lost the control over their bodies. The same situation was in Belarus, but in Belarus for different reasons. Women led the revolution. Okay, if Navalny is if Navalny wouldn't exist, and you would think who could be how you imagine somebody who's a real danger to Putin, it could be someone who fights with corruption, someone who is young, different, unlike, you know, old nomenclature of Russia that resembles a little bit like a late Soviet Union now. But who could be an antithesis to Lukashenko, like to totalitarian male who wants to call himself Bachka, like a father? Woman, every man. Tsikhanouska, who didn't even want to be a politician, and other women who took to the streets in the worst moment, when after 3 days of tortures, shots in the streets, everything seemed to be over, and then spontaneously women went to the street. Not workers first, not students first, women, and then all other classes joined. And these two things, of course, the Polish women and Belarusian women are in different situation, but I think this is something that we should first observe in Eastern Europe, because maybe it's and here is also another context. It shows you also what distinguishes Eastern Europe from Western Europe.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I mean, this is a question that Shalini now brought up and you brought up, and of course it is so central. And I want to perhaps pinpoint this question of gender and ask, how do we explain the relevance of gender to both the unmaking of democracy and to the remaking? Masha, you have written at length about homophobia, toxic masculinity, although I'm not sure if you used that phrase, in terms of, particularly in your book on The Future is History. What would your take be? What's the particular relevance of gender for unmaking, remaking democracy? And your mic is off still.
Thank you for reminding me. I think there are a few ways to think about it, and I think they're all useful. The way that I've been thinking about why these newfangled autocrats, or old-fangled autocrats like Lukashenko, go after LGBT people, after gender studies, in such a consistent and internationally really similar way, right, is, I mean, you could think of it as a sort of vast international conspiracy, and I've reported on these far-right networks, but I don't think that's an explanation, and I haven't been impressed enough by these networks to assign much agency to them. I think they're much more sort of really a case of people coming together in a meeting of hearts and minds and fears. But I think that for all of these regimes, it is, first of all, important to reverse the most recent and most rapid social change. All of these regimes are past-oriented. They all come to power on the promise of a return to an imaginary past. And what better way is there to signal that the return has begun than to reverse the gains in both the rights movements, but also in the way we think and talk about gender. And I think what it communicates is, you want to go back to a time when you were not made uncomfortable by things you didn't understand, when you were not made uncomfortable by being compelled or imagining that you're being compelled to use language that feels unfamiliar to you. We're going to give this to you. We're going to to return you back to that space. There's also, of course, and this is also universal, right? There's this huge trafficking in the fear for children. And of course, the sort of gender discourse is something that that creates conflicts between generations. This is where we do see rapid change, and so we see these autocratic leaders basically saying they're after your children, quite literally, as they do in Russia when they introduce laws against homosexual propaganda to minors or ban adoptions by same-sex couples. We're in the United States, where in these the QAnon conspiracies are really focused on fear of pedophilia, right? But also just figuratively, like if you are feeling disconnected from your children, if you don't understand your kid who went to college and came back and said that they have changed their pronouns, we're going to get the people who have snatched your children. And that's the oldest trope in the book. So I think that's one way to think about it, and I think it's very useful. Another way, of course, to think about it is that democracy is not, and this is where I might differ from some of the panelists. I don't think democracy is a set of institutions. Democracy is a way of society developing. Democracy is a trajectory. Democracy is always in the future. It is the government of the governed, and since we will never have a government of all the governed, we can only measure our progress, right? Are we enfranchising more and more people with the passage of time, or fewer people? And as Slavik pointed out, in most of these countries, in one way or another, women continue to be disenfranchised. And so anti-democratic reversal is a way to disenfranchise more women in more ways. And movement toward democracy is are ways of enfranchising more women in more ways. And finally, I think, demographic panic, which is something that Shalini and I used to talk about back when I was at IWM finishing The Future is History. It's not unrelated to what I was talking about in the beginning, right? This fear of rapid change. But it also, one way to address demographic panic is to reassure the population that women's bodies are under control and will be performing the functions for which they're supposedly intended, right? It's this utter instrumentalization of women's bodies, and that's of course why gender ideology is such a universally useful boogeyman, because gender ideology is the thing that takes women's bodies out of their intended role and fuels more demographic panic.
Thanks. Now, I want to open it up to the audience, but I have one last question, so audience members can get ready and think of a question. But the one question that I still have and that I want to address, because it is important to our research project, concerns the notion of the West. Our research focus explores the Atlantic world, and by Atlantic world, we don't mean just what used to be called the West. So we don't mean just a geographic region comprising North America and Europe, but rather a region that includes Africa as much as South America. And yet, when we look at authoritarian regimes today, they tend to define themselves over against the West. And the West seems also to be an important reference point for democratic movements in Eastern Europe. And so the question is, can liberal democracy be reclaimed without also reclaiming some notion of the West, right? And is it possible to strip that notion of the West, that concept of the West, of its Eurocentric baggage? Is that at all possible? Shalini, how would you see this given your work in post-colonial studies and also your work on liberal democracy?
So that's a large question, Johannes. I'll come to it in a moment, but just one or two remarks to the previous discussion on gender. I think what I would like to add to the question of gender is reproduction is really central. The whole question of reproduction is central to all of these regimes. And this is partly because they all have an ideology of ethnic purity. So there is always this fear of this nation whose ethnic purity is endangered by some kind of minorities which do not make up that pure national body politic. So I think demographic panics are linked very much to body politics, which are linked very much to the idea of a homogeneous body politic. And I think that is one of the reasons why gender becomes so central to this. The other question I had, the other thing I wanted to say relates very much to what you were asking Slavik about, the question of a democratic personality. And with that, I come to the West as well. When you were talking with him, I realized that there is something very interesting in the Indian anti-colonial movement, and that is Gandhi's idea that this is not about liberalism. This is about democratic practices are practices of nonviolence, which are practices. So there I would go with Masha and say this is about, in his case, even bodily practices. So he said, what do you do against an armed oppressor like the British? Violent, armed, you are going to go in for non-violent resistance of it. So what you need to do is to cultivate a subjectivity and bodily practices which will allow you this kind of non-violent resistance. So it's not coded in terms of liberalism, because don't forget, looked at from the colony, liberalism was actually completely hypocritical. This was the same liberalism that at home asked for equal rights, etc., and in the colony practiced the most violent of racial and other discriminations. So there was not much baggage that liberalism, a positive baggage, which it always carried. So yes, the democratic aspirations, yes, but the call for liberalism rings very hollow when looked at from the colony. So there's this very interesting interview which Gandhi gives to a young British journalist, in which he's quoted as saying, he's asked Mr. Gandhi, what do you think of Western civilization? He says it would be a very good idea. So I think, I think one has to look at the whole question of liberalism differently. But on the question of gender, he was very interesting. All the political practices which he introduced into the public arena were domestic practices, which in the Indian homes were considered feminist practices. Fasting as a form of protest against your mother-in-law or your husband. This is what he did, is fast in the public space. So the hypermasculinity was either the armed struggle of the Indian National Army or of the Hindu right-wings parties, which were modeled on fascism in Europe. So against that, he cultivates a bodily sensitivity and a sensibility and subjectivity, which is made up of self-disciplinary practices, which are all feminist practices out of the domestic sphere, and takes them into the public sphere as a way of cultivating it. So just to go back to your, to cultivating a democratic subjectivity. So it's not about personality, but it's about bodily practices, which he really forefronts as practices of nonviolent resistance. So the question of the West is an interesting one. I would first say, look, let's go back to Edward Said, who said the West is imaginary geography. So anybody can be included and excluded out of the West depending on the context. So often Japan gets excluded, as Stuart Hall used to say, Japan is an honorary member of the Western Club. So you can, suddenly put that. You can exclude Eastern Europe because it's not Western enough. Suddenly you can then exclude Russia, of course, because it's Oriental, whether Turkey belongs to Europe or not. So these are all imaginary geographies which are very, very shifting. One can deconstruct the notion of the West in many ways. I have made two arguments here, which I'll just make very briefly. One, I don't think you necessarily need one liberal model, because look at India. Here is a country which introduced democratic elections, a nation in which 60% of people couldn't read or write. It was very, very poor. It was a country which was unequal as unequal could be, socially and economically, and yet it introduced democracy for itself in 1947 by introducing what was a communitarian democracy. And it introduced affirmative action for the disadvantaged castes in India, the so-called untouchables, the Dalits. It introduces collective rights of communities, much before any constitution in the world introduces collective rights in Canada or Australia. So it had a model which was part liberal, part communitarian, and you could say it's, cut itself a model of democracy out of the cloth, which was socially quite different in many ways. And therefore, its model of secularism was a different model, because it's not about separation of church and state, but equidistance of the state from 6, 7 different religions. So it has an understanding of all of these, which could be termed very differently depending on the political context. I think Latin American democracies introduced some very interesting experimental elements, which which would be interesting to look at. So these are not copies of Western models. In fact, as I could show you in the Indian case very carefully, many of these measures were introduced much before they were discussed in the Western context. So I don't think one necessarily needs a Western model here as a homogeneous, singular Western model which needs to get exported anywhere. The other last point I would make is on Eurocentrism, and that is to say what I have been arguing in a lot of my work is basically that the West is co-constituted in this imperial formation. So it's not as if the West emerges sui generis from somewhere and then exports something somewhere in this very billiard ball kind of model of all agency on the part of the West, and then the colonial other reacts to something or the other and picks up and imitates, and always imitates badly, so it can always lack or lag something, as Dinesh Chakrabarty says. I think the point to see is that all of these are practices which are forged in interaction with one another, and that's the notion I've used always of entangled histories of modernity. And I think if we use that kind of framework, I think this binary of where is the West, what is the West, is this Western or not, disappears. And I think because it's politically, I think, a problematic way to look at things, and I think theoretically it has no purchase for me.
Mm-hmm. All right. Of course, this is something we could discuss at length. But I would open it up at this point, and I ask you to use the hand raise symbol, which you find at the bottom of your screen, in order to let me know that you want to ask a question. And I am sure that there are questions. Yes, I see. Yes, 2 hands are up. Pavan Malreddy is first.
Can you hear me, Johannes?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm quite taken by the idea of communitarian democracy that Shalini just put forth. But this question goes in a different direction. Johannes, when you started, you spoke of the idea of need for a reform in democracy. And my question is to the forum in general. On the one hand, I see there is so much discursive finesse, the ethical, moral, and philosophical breadth that encompasses and ennobles the idea of democracy. And on the other hand, I see a crude numerical majority-minority model of representation. There is no other way except for the idea of communitarian democracy that Shalini spoke just now. I see there is no other way, no other measure, no other means of representation outside of this crude numerical model of 2/3 of representation or 32% of majority. Right? In some cases in India, and I know cases where 11% parties can come together and get into power, right? And how does that speak for representation? And I think one example I think of right now is on January 20th, Biden said democracy has prevailed, referring to the numbers he got. A few weeks down the line, after Trump's acquittal, he said democracy is fragile, referring to not to the numbers he didn't get, but precisely to hide those numbers and make a moral assault on the idea of democracy that there is, as if holding the nameless citizens responsible for this fragility. So my question to the forum is that this disjunct between the model of representation we have, purely based on numbers, and this extremely philosophical, rich idea of vistas and spheres and entire moral discourse we have of democracy, how do you see this disjunct, and is this disjunct universal, or is it just specific to some countries?
Thank you, Pavan. Who would like to take that question? Masha would like to. Just unmute yourself. Thank you.
I'll take a quick stab. Of course, there's a disjuncture, and I think this little panel, which I have found incredibly informative and inspiring, is also a little bit of an example. We start talking about democracy as though we all agreed on a definition of democracy, which I don't think we do, and I don't think we can. But even the ways in which we use the word democracy in this conversation are vastly different from the ways that the word democracy is used by politicians and journalists in any of our countries. We have a whole bunch of countries among us. And I think I'll speak to the United States, right? I think that the word democracy is used to denote the rule of the majority in the American public sphere, electoral institutions, and in some more sophisticated discussion, the system of checks and balances. It is not generally used to mean even the abstract ideals on which the country was founded, which would be actually a much better metric to apply to whether we're succeeding or failing. And I think when Biden was talking about democracy has prevailed, democracy is fragile, he was talking about institutions of representation, which, what they have to do with those abstract ideals continues to be an open question.
Yes. Would any of the other two like to respond as well? Yes. Sławomir.
Why I started to dispute this idea of talking about democracy when we were talking about liberal democracy or liberalism and democracy together was that, look at it from the most basic perspective. We are in 1989. To implement democracy, actually, it's an easy issue. Like, it's a question of procedures. There is a, first term parliament, new constitution, or something that should be like work as a constitution, and then to prepare the real one. So this was kind of an easy issues, like all these procedures that Masha mentioned. But then imagine what it means to implement liberalism in the society, like liberal thinking, tradition, kind of a respect to institutions, like the fact that when in America, Trump began his term with the clash with the local court, which said that the ban against like some of the like the ban against seven states to welcome people from 7 states. It was forbidden for these people. So the court said, no, it's illegal. You can't do it this way, even if you are president. And we are just a small local court somewhere. When the Constitutional Court in Poland announces or the Supreme Court announces some ruling, Polish government just don't print it. Done. Okay. So I think here's the difference with the in the society or even like or institutions, like in a very, very broad sense, where just imagination doesn't allow you to do certain things. Like Fox News is a good example. Fox News, or even Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell is the biggest possible opportunist in American politics. And still, Mike Pence was accepting everything what Trump did. He was with him with the most compromising, embarrassing moments. At the end of the day, in the moment of truth, somehow this, I would say, liberal tradition worked. And it's not the case of Poland. It's not the case of Hungary. It's not the case of some other countries here. Of course, but my conclusion would be actually the same as Masha's conclusion. So that it's the direction, but it's a really, really long way for some countries. And this is I think the main difference, or the main problems when we're talking about illiberal democracies and about this entire scene of populism everywhere.
All right, we have 5 more minutes, and I saw earlier that Bernd van Malzahn raised his hand, although not the digital hand, but I saw it nonetheless. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Johannes. When we compare United States with Poland, Hungary, Turkey, India, and so on, it's a bit dangerous sometimes, because as we just heard, some countries have a strong tradition of liberalism and democracy, and that's the reason they might stand these dangers and overcome these dangers easier than others. But as Trump is the one who brought everything now to the table, I wonder if we look now for the United States, what happened before Trump. I remember the Tea Party. I remember a lot of developments in the United States, which no longer accepted that what we call the democratic institutions. So for me, the question is, why is this nationalism, or we could call it anti-establishment, probably that's the best one, anti-establishment in the United States was born probably 20 years ago. And it's only now peaked with Trump. And my question is the same discussion you are involving now, us all, also looking for this anti-establishment, or is this too narrow, what I just say? Because when I see this anti-establishment in the United States, and sometimes here in Germany and in other areas who have not that tradition. Germany has not that big tradition of democracy, as we know. But I find out that those who have this anti-establishment attitude feel a little bit lost, feel not accepted in the society? Is it due to a wrong globalization question mark? Is it due to a certain arrogance of an elite which does not care for some basic constituencies? So my question is probably not 100% for this audience, but for me, Trump is just following a trend in the United States of anti-establishment, and he does it 100% or 1,000%. And I don't know whether that is the same with the other countries. Thank you.
Thanks. Who would like to take a stab? The anti-establishment question, which to me is always something that comes up in discussions of populism. Masha, could you address this?
Sure. So I think in the American context, I'm a little hesitant to use the term anti-establishment because it actually usually refers to the left starting in the 1960s. But I think, yes, it's Johannes is right. It's we're talking about a kind of accepted trait of populism, which is this anti-elite sentiment, this imagination that the elites have betrayed the population and have coddled the other, whatever the other is, right? And I think that Bernd's comment that this is a long-term trend is absolutely on point. And I think that there are really kind of two ways to think about Trump, two ways in which Trump is talked about in this country. One is as an anomaly, as almost somebody from outer space, or at least somebody installed by the Russians, a president unlike any that the United States has ever had. And another way to talk about him, much less common, is to talk about him as just another Republican president and a logical sort of continuation of Republican politics. And I think the challenge actually is to think about him in both ways at the same time. It is absolutely accurate that he is unlike any president that the United States had ever had before in just sort of the biographical, temperamental, sort of performative ways, really unlike any other president. And yet the conditions for Trumpism were created long before Trump came into office, right? And I would trace them to long-term Republican rhetoric of anti-government, and maybe that's in our situation more accurate than anti-establishment, right? There's sort of the idea, and this dates back to Ronald Reagan, right? The idea that government is an unnecessary evil, right? That the less government you have, the better. And it sort of reaches its apogee with Trump, who literally declares the destruction of government to be his goal, and literally packs a cabinet full of people who are not only incompetent and new to government, but explicitly opposed to the mission of and the job of whatever agency they're appointed to head. This is something that has sort of gotten lost in all the noise of Trumpism, but it's an incredibly important trait of it. And I think to just jump ahead because we're out of time, I think part of the question, and this is where I think that thinking about totalitarianism is actually really helpful, right? And Arendt's work on the masses, right? What part of the question is what happens to all of these people that Trump brought into politics, who had not been participants in politics before. Right? America has a very low level of participation, and certainly in exact accordance with Arendt's analysis of how the masses that have been entirely left out of politics and left out of any kind of political allegiance, or when she wrote about the classless society, people who respond to this call to anti-government and this anti-elite rhetoric in the most visceral way, what happens to them after Trump is no longer president? And do they become a key player in American politics? And we don't know.
And Bernd's question had a comparative dimension to it. And Shalini, perhaps you could take that up and take it outside the United States or beyond the US frame, because that seems to me an important question as well, whether the establishment, anti-establishment taxonomy has any purchase beyond the immediate case at hand here.
Well, there has been a rhetoric, of course, in the Indian case of anti-establishment means anti-Congress party, which is the party which was central to getting India's independence from British rule. It was a very capacious, large umbrella party, which was a centrist party, but which had all kinds of factions within it. And it ruled for a long time. So anti-establishment in the Indian case has always been a rhetoric against anti-Congress. But in the Congress, because Nehru, who was the first Prime Minister of India, had also a dynastic streak in the party. So then Indira Gandhi, his daughter, and then her son, Rajiv, who was also a Prime Minister until he was killed. And then his wife, who is Italian, has been holding the reins of the party, not as prime minister, but as party president. So it also became then a synonym, actually, that it was a code word for basically against the Nehru family. So yes, you do have this rhetoric, but I don't think that explains very much in the Indian case, to be honest. I would make two different arguments here. One, I don't agree very much with Bernd von Malsen's idea that the United States will be saved because of its liberal traditions. I think you really forget, if you think of it in that sense, what the whole Black Lives Matter movement is about, not about tradition. It's about racism, which needs to be dismantled. This is not part of a liberal tradition. So I think we really have a problem here between a total discrepancy between liberal ideas and their practices. This is what I was saying. So it's not just in the colony that you saw liberal ideas being actually the put into practice in their opposite, but even in the United States, you did not have a practice of those ideas. So it's been a as Masha wants to say, it's in the future. I would say I would even want to look at democratic practices in the present. I don't want to defer it to the future, because in the Indian case, what I find really interesting, and I think the emphasis on practice is important for me. They're related to institutions, but I'm an anthropologist, so I'm not a political scientist. So I really look at democratic practices or soft authoritarian practices, because what you're seeing these days is, if you want to trace soft authoritarianism, you have to look at the practices within formal democratic institutions in order to get a sense of how they are being hollowed out from within. But in the Indian case, I think one of the interesting things is that in India, it's the opposite story of the disenfranchisement. In India, the poor have all gone to vote and have voted every government in or out. It's the middle classes and the elite who has stayed away from electoral politics. So democracy in India has always been saved by the poor, not by the middle classes. And we have huge voter turnouts. We have voter turnouts of 70 and 80%, unheard of in parts of Europe, and especially among the poor, who in Europe are seen as depoliticized, marginalized, etc. So I think we really have to go very much by context, and it's not the liberal tradition which gets them to vote. It's this feeling that democracy has empowered them in some sense for the very first time in their lives. What exactly then of concrete benefits economically it has brought to them, we can have a discussion about where all the kinds of things which were promised were never materialized. But I think that, and that I think the other point I would like to make in the larger context, because I think Bernd von Malsen mentioned globalization. I don't know if it's about globalization, but it's definitely neoliberalism. And one of the effects of that has been austerity politics everywhere. And part of the story of Trumpism, not all of it, but part of the story of the Brexit story is the story of austerity politics, and those who have really borne the brunt of that austerity politics have then, for reasons which we don't need to go into here, have blamed Brussels for it, which is absolutely, shifting the blame onto something else. But the deflection doesn't matter. The rhetoric of take control again suggests that if there was national sovereignty, you would then have a reversal of deindustrialization, of the dismantling of social security, etc., which is not going to be the case. But the point there is it's not globalization. It's very much about national governments having imposed austerity politics using neoliberal prescriptions. This is not the case in India. This is not where the support for Modi comes from, but this is the case in many of the countries that we see in Europe, certainly.
Shalini, this was a wonderful summing up and pinpointing many strands of the discussion, a bravado comment at the end of our discussion. And I think we should really take this as the final word of this discussion that has to be stopped short eventually. And that moment has unfortunately come now. So I want to thank our three guests, our three panelists. I want to thank Masha and Shalini and Sławomir once again for bringing in lots of different perspectives. Not that everything or anything has been cleared up for once and for all, but I think we have gotten new inspirations in how to think about the crisis of democracy. And we didn't really get to talk about the reinventing of democracy all that much, but at least a little bit. And so I want to thank the audience for participating, for being there, for listening, for being interested. And those of us who will be part of the internal Democratic Vistas discussion, including our three guests, will receive the link for that or have already received it in the next couple of minutes, and we should reconvene in 10 minutes. So at 6:35 in 10 minutes. So thanks, everybody. I hope that we will see you again at a future Democratic Vistas event at the Forschungskolleg or on Zoom, one of the two. And perhaps there will be more collaborations between EVM and FKH. I think that would also be very profitable for everybody involved. So goodbye, everybody. Thank you so much. See you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.